Well, good evening to everyone. I hope you all are doing well on this beautiful evening, wherever you are. I hope it's a beautiful evening. We are in fairly good weather here. It's about 50s outside. It's really nice here in Columbus right now. There are, I would say, it's a little windy. In fact, I think we're under a wind advisory for the next couple hours, which seems to be fairly common around here. But it's still been a beautiful day. The kids and my wife have gotten out for a little bit today and the rest too. So it's just been one of those good days to be able to spend time out and about. And so I'm grateful for the opportunities that we have on this beautiful evening to come together to have a discussion on a topic that is quite candidly one of those that when it was suggested to me, I went, okay, that should be fun. And in fact, I probably put this one up there with something that originally made me a little bit more uncomfortable, even than doing things like critical race theory, intersectionality, and gender identity, because I've spoken on those so often. And so I don't know what you would be expecting from the concept of a Christian in politics, but I will do my best to give you. I guess some thoughts along the way, and some insights. I have a lot of quotes tonight. In fact, I kind of leaned into a couple of different authors historically that I've always loved. Some that I know you've known quite well, that deal with politics, that deal with these kind of things, in what I find to be a fairly balanced way. And so I want to kind of dive into that. So I'm going to do my best to not get into the weeds of specific concepts or specific political groups. I'm going to do my best. There are moments in where I do feel, as I've told you all before, where I will feel a need to lean in to say this is what I believe, and this is what I think is true. But as always, I encourage everyone to do your own research and to find what you have, why you believe. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, there was a class I taught a while back that was called "Does It Matter If I Know What I Believe?" And this class was specifically tied to, obviously, theological points. And yes, David Lipscomb has entered the chat in some ways, without a doubt. But theologically, the class that I taught was based off of the idea of, do you actually know what you believe? Or is it just something that you say you believe? There's a lot of topics of which we have inherited reasons for why we believe something. And that happens in theology and religion all the time. It also happens in politics. One of the things that my mom used to say is my parents or my grandparents on my mom's side were, she would often say, kind of like diehard Democrats. The problem with that is that my mom and them would go, yeah, but if they were alive today, they would not be. It's not the same. Like parties change over time, things change over time. Certain parties have changed more so than other parties have, at least the rhetoric and the things that they would throw about at different times. But even in faith, that's the case, where we inherit things from times before. We inherit labels, we inherit concepts and titles. And so this is where we have to be very careful also of kind of defining our terms, what we mean when we say certain things, what's the point of all of this. So when I say politics, I really am kind of leaning into the very premise of government, politics, and the rest. Now, I also need to readily admit I am a political junkie in a lot of ways, and some of you might find that interesting. Some of you might be that. In fact, let me ask you, if you are a political junkie, let me tell you what I mean by that. Not that you are possibly even an ardent person that goes out there and is campaigning for people, which is perfectly fine. I'm referencing literally that I actively love all political shows. I tend to love even watching like election nights and all those things. Like I'm fascinated. I'll stay up late for that. Not even just in the U.S. In fact, I do that for the Italian government elections and the rest, and I will actually watch all day the British ones. Which, by the way, if you ever want to watch them, that's just fantastic, especially for the different seats in Parliament and things. I really am a political junkie. I love the nuances of how all of that works, the premises behind it, how people come to know and come into different positions. Some of my favorites is the local politics in some of the little counties and the rest across the UK, where they always have somebody like that's on the ballot, because I think pretty much anybody can get on the ballot in some ways. They'll have somebody dressed in like I forget which one of them was. It was a guy with a strainer on his head, and he was Mr. Spaghetti Man or something, was running for office against. I think it was Boris Johnson too. So it's just kind of ridiculous things. So I love sometimes the absurdity of the politics. Television, I love political shows, some of my favorites. The West Wing is probably one of my favorite shows of all time. Love that, even though I would disagree with a lot of the politics inherently within it. Love the whole framing of it, the concept of government, the concept of power, and how decisions are made. So I kind of lay that on the table to tell you. In some ways, I was like, this is a really fun topic. I really would enjoy this. So I don't want you to think I'm coming at this as from the Christian perspective of all politics is evil, or that there is no such time as to take a side. So it's not necessarily, even as was mentioned earlier, kind of the David Lipscomb where a Christian has to step back from all things. In the same way, it's not a Christian must be involved in all things, must be in, active in all politics along the way. I don't believe that there's an either or. There's a few things I'll just mention from the top that I believe a Christian should, and then we're going to dive into just some kind of conversations, some quotes. I know this will shock a lot of you, but there's quite a few things that were actually said by C.S. Lewis a long time ago, almost 100 years ago, on politics and the rest that I think are actually quite competent to where we are today, ironically, and even some from G.K. Chesterton and others that I think are very pertinent to what we're doing tonight and what we're talking about. So let me start off by saying that God, in his sovereignty and the fact that he lives outside of time, is not surprised by anything. I used to use this example all the time where God does not drive an ambulance. He's never surprised by anything that's happening. Like somebody's elected president or the rest, and he's like, oh my goodness, I didn't see that happen. I can't believe they did that. Because he exists outside of time, we often forget this because we are people of a linear concept where we go from, birth in essence to death. And so we see everything within the concept of a linear timeline of history of life. And we don't necessarily realize that God existing outside of time, not only does he know things, but he has permitted and allows things. If you look at Habakkuk, it's one of my favorite stories from Scripture, specifically because the only thing we know of Habakkuk is his name and that he was a prophet in the specific time period right after King Josiah was killed in battle, right after the people of Judah had just become back, and they were now suddenly back online with God. They were doing all the things. They had torn down all the old idols. Then he dies in battle, and they go right back to the way things were. And here you have Habakkuk going basically to God, why in the world would you let this happen? Like, how could you allow this to happen? These people, they were finally back in your current corner. They were finally back to worshiping you and so forth. And then you let their leader die. And then soon after, God turns around and says to him, you wouldn't believe the things that I have in store for you. And that's a verse that we quote all the time. In fact, it's on mugs and all sorts of places, and we never read the next verse. And the next verse specifically denotes and goes, for I'm sending the Chaldeans or the Babylonians to come and to annihilate everything and as punishment. And then suddenly Habakkuk's going, whoa, slow down, not that. Like, they're worse than we are. And so there's this whole premise of how God plays out in history, how God allows things to happen in history. And just as an example, I wanted to bring this forth. So in Genesis 15, it specifically says, I'm going to read quite a few verses of Genesis 15 because I think it helps us to understand something in particular. Starting in verse 1, it says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, this man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and the number of the stars, and if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted to him as righteousness. And then it says, and he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each one over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. So I'm just going to stop there for a second and then go for just this little part here. So here we have Abram, soon to be called Abraham, who has been called out by God, who has been given the promise that his heirs will number more than the stars. And yet here he finds himself suddenly still without a child, questioning and wondering, and he believes that God will do these things. But then there's this great darkness that comes upon him, and then this premise of 400 years that his heirs will be afflicted and servants there in a land that is not their own. Now, if you've read much of the rest of Genesis and then into Exodus, you know who those people are. In fact, you get to the point of reading Exodus, early parts of Exodus, you see the people of Israel, the descendants of the 12 sons of the 12 tribes and so forth, have grown such exponentially that the Egyptians, where they had run to because of the famine with the story of Joseph and the rest, suddenly there was a Pharaoh who did not know them, did not remember Joseph, and because of that started worrying about them, puts them in bondage, in slavery, and so forth. And then there's an interesting part of this. He says, but I will bring judgment on that, and they will be afflicted for 400 years, but I will bring judgment on that nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, you shall be buried in a good old age. So here's this promise, long before it happened, to Abram, of the descendants, but we also miss the fact that he's not just the descendants, it's something that will happen to his descendants that will happen for 400 years. And this is the problem we often had because we are people that are linear in nature. That another example I often give is that if life was, if eternity, if God himself, timeline in essence, was a 1 hour long movie, our moment in the movie would be a millisecond, a split millisecond in the middle of the movie. And yet we often step out of that millisecond and look at the rest, and we can't even see the rest of the movie, but we look at the director going, what a terrible movie, I don't understand this. I don't understand what you're trying to do. And it's because we don't exist outside of time, so we can't see the larger picture. So here, this larger picture is painted to Abram, knowing that there will be hard times and that there will be his descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. There will be servants there. They will be afflicted for 400 years. So why do I bring this up? Because God, throughout history, and especially throughout the Bible, exists outside of time, but knows, and his promises that all things will be good and that things will happen in the future, or that he will return one day and so forth, that those things have always come to fruition. And because we are such linear people, we often miss that and forget that. And so suddenly every election or every moment seems like the end of the world for all of us consistently. And it's quite sad in a lot of ways to sit there and watch as people, I'll use the word bloviate, every single election, every single moment in time until either the greatest moment in the history of the world or the worst moment in the history of the world. And right now, if we can be honest, in our political world, especially in the United States, we are at a point where rhetoric is at an all-time high. And that I could easily say is on both sides of the political aisles. I will also note that from my own personal perspective, this is where I will situate myself and the rest. Hypocrisy abounds pretty consistently, but I'm also shocked. And I guess I should say I'm shocked by the sin that we are so easily allow these days, would be the best way I would put that. And that's not a political statement, that is a spiritual statement. The things that we celebrate, the things that we demand of others and so forth. And so I just wanted to lay that forth. So specifically, as I kind of launch this and going into, obviously we're going to look at Romans 2 here in a bit, I wanted to note that God existing outside of times and God using even what we could see as negative leaders or politically terrible leaders, or leaders that are harsh and problematic and the rest, is how God has worked throughout history. The Chaldeans, especially if you read Habakkuk, specifically noted them as being swift and vile and very, very harsh, and they were horrific in their tortures and the things that they did. They were not known for their grace and their mercy, and yet they were used as a tool, allowed to be used as a tool to bring the people of God back to repentance to Him. And so I don't think any of us should ever miss the fact that God is continuing to work. God continues to work. And also, just real quick, the 400 years, if you know, and some of you might know how old the United States is. So if you know how old the United States is, we're still about 150 years away from 400 years. So I can only imagine what 400 years would have been like for a people to feel the oppression, to feel the slavery and the rest that they dealt with. And so I just kind of put it in context with how we often think that a day or two of trauma, a day or two of moments. And this is also, I'll situate myself a little bit in this. It's also my struggle at times with people who claim traumas for everything or issues for everything, is that they never situate themselves in history. It's always based off of their own little moment, their own little thing that happened to them, as if it's the worst thing that's ever happened to someone in the history of mankind and the rest. Now, and here's the crazy part. Right now, I feel the desire and the need, or even the responsibility, to say, obviously, there are real bad things that happen to people all the time that are very real. I don't want to negate that in any way, shape, or form. I shouldn't have to say that, because that should be an assumption. But in the culture in which we live right now, you're no longer allowed to assume anything about anybody. In fact, you have to specifically state it, or you are against it, or you are meaning something negative. As an example, if I were to say, and this is just the social media world, you guys can tell me if I'm wrong, but if I were to say, I love dogs, then somebody might jump on there and say, yes, well, that obviously that means you hate cats. And I would go, okay, that's not necessarily what I said at all. And they'll be like, yeah, but it's obvious, because if you love dogs, then you have to hate cats. That's just kind of how people love to play things out. It's this binary concept of mentality. It's actually very, very dangerous. And it's the way we live in their current world. And so I kind of wanted to situate us there real quick before we dive into some of these quotes, some of these other things that I have for us tonight. So that this first truth is that God permeates and supersedes every aspect of history, of life. It is God's will that takes precedent over everything and everyone. And God's plans and purposes are fixed, and His will will not be violated. And so I want to set that forward. That's my belief. That's what I believe about history. It's what I believe about time, where we are at today, and so forth. What He has purposed will happen. And no government or no leader or no moment in history will change that in any way, shape, or form. And so I just want to make sure that that's clear. I believe we see that in Matthew. We see that in Daniel especially. We also see that in Romans. We also need to kind of grasp this kind of very key fact. No political movement will save mankind. It will not in any way, shape, or form. I do believe that there are some that are better than others, but that does not mean that in any way, shape, or form they will save mankind. The only salvation is from Jesus the Christ, period. That's the only way that one comes to salvation. So there is no way, nothing that we could put forth as a political argument or political goal that all of us should get to that would lead people to salvation outside of Jesus Christ. And so that's a very key thing. Also, I just want to kind of throw this out there as kind of a beginning before we get in there. We have no doubt as Christians the responsibility to government to obey laws, to be good citizens. I believe we see that in Romans 13, right there at the beginning. God has also established these leaders and the rest in our world, and He does so for our benefit. Now, that does not mean that you have to celebrate or get behind their premise of what they're pushing and what their agendas are and so forth. You do not have to do that, I believe. I believe that your conscience, especially in light of Scripture, teaches us very strong to stand for that which is true. But it does not mean that we have the right inherently of rebelling against things that we disagree with politically, as opposed to things that might lead us away from God, things that would lead us away from a faith in Jesus. And so that's the balance I kind of want to lay down real quick on that, just as some thoughts. So one of my favorites, and this is something that I think a lot of us experienced recently, is a fantastic quote by C.S. Lewis that you may all know or have heard before, and it's this one. And so I want to throw this out there to you. I may actually copy this and put this in the chat. We'll see if I can. I don't have the Facebook thing put up for me, but I'll just mention this to me and tell me what you think. This is C.S. Lewis writing in, I believe it's in The Weight of Glory. He wrote this. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at some point be satiated, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so without the approval, with the approval of their own conscience. So let me put that out there real quick. Tell me what you think real quick about that, and I'll read it out again for you. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at some point be satiated, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. And so if I were to put this in a more recent terms, it would be something about this. And this isn't political. This is purely as a discussion starter in some ways. I wear a mask. Everyone should wear a mask because it's what's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And so I'm not arguing mask. I'm actually asking the question, the moral philosophical question, in essence, from politics and the political world. This is one that I think Lewis specifically said, this is the worst of all tyrannies. The worst of all forms of governments is those who specifically are moral busybodies who utilize, in essence, in what I like to call weaponizing empathy. They weaponize empathy because they do it because they have decided it's what's best for all. It's what's best for all people. So tell me what you think about that. If you have a comment or thought, go ahead and put that in the comment. Even if you're watching later on, put this in the comments. I'd love to know what you think about that quote, and I'll go back and add that quote a little bit later here too. Again, I love the idea that it would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. Because you see, with moral busybodies, especially in politics today, this is one of the, like I said, I use a modern terminology for that, which is weaponized empathy. And so you might ask the question, well, what do I mean by weaponized empathy? It's when you make a moral argument against something and you inflict upon others this idea that the only right answer is that which you've proposed, period. Because if you were to disagree with them, then how dare you, because it's about your identity, if it's about who you are, and so forth. So it's a weaponization of empathy. All right, let's see. I see somebody say absolutely because there's a legitimate, socially acceptable justification for whatever ends up happening. Absolutely. And so this is where the moral busybodies, you could constantly be, anything you say becomes reality, becomes what you want, becomes what's best for everyone, intrinsically. And that in and of itself is a problem. In fact, I think more than ever, because of what we've experienced over these last couple of years, this concept of a moral busybody, omnipotent moral busybody, feels far more relevant than it did maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago. We may not have had a real life experience of what that looks like. I'll give you another one. So I have a lot of friends that live in Europe. In fact, I was in Europe during the fall of the wall. As a child, I remember the influx of immigrants that came to Italy that were immigrating out of the old Eastern Bloc and the rest that came through there. And then you fast forward to today and you see the war in Ukraine and Russia and just truly horrific scenes, horrific things across the world. And from a political standpoint, you have fairly large back and forth over supporting Ukraine and it's supporting Ukraine or not supporting Ukraine. However, if you were to say something like not supporting Ukraine, what would people intrinsically actually think you were saying? Because of the world we live in, that means that you must be pro-Russia or pro-Putin or whatever it may be along that way. There are others, so if you know anything about what's happening somewhat in the Ukraine, there are horrible atrocities that are happening to Ukrainian people. Living in a war zone is just unreal. I can't imagine what it would be like to be there. But there are also some very terrible things that have been done in light of the betterment of all people. So to keep all Ukrainians safe from political upheaval and so forth, one of the things that's recently been banned is actually a lot of churches have been closed. You're no longer allowed to go to any type of Orthodox church that used to be associated with Russian Orthodox churches and so forth. And so it is a sad reality right now is that there's actually religious persecution happening in the Ukraine for the betterment of the war effort of the things that are happening there. And so we often, like I said, binary choices. You're either pro-Ukraine or pro-Russia, whatever it is, instead of going, or I could just be really against this part. Like I do not like the aggression of Russia. I believe it's evil. I believe that Ukraine has a right to determine its own destiny and so forth. I candidly don't have a whole lot of problems with the fact that we're supporting them in some ways financially, although I think it's getting ridiculous at this point in time, especially with a lot of the issues we have in our own nation that are going on, including in the state of Ohio right now. So we've got a lot of ways in which you could balance these things out, but it is problematic because we're no longer allowed to take specific moments. It's almost like you have to accept all or nothing, and the all or nothing is through weaponized empathy. So, I mean, I can't believe you wouldn't support them because obviously then you must be pro-Putin or whatever it may be. And that's a sad binary that we currently live. So Kelly said, sadly, a side effect of that is making really strong statements about each other and tearing each other down. Yes, it's no longer I think A and you think B. It's I think A and that's the right thing, so therefore B is evil. Yes. In a small percent of situations that may be true, but it's not very loving to always jump to those who disagree with them. Or correct, absolutely. In fact, I had a moment just about an hour ago in the rest where somebody made a statement that I read and I went, I could read that, and I believe I would have been right to read it and read into it, that they were actually implying something that was fairly evil about somebody else, fairly wrong about somebody else. And they were making a very broad generalization. And so instead of jumping to that, what I tried to do is step back for a second and go, here's what I read. Is this what you meant, or did you mean something else? And they were able to come in and say, actually, no, that's not what I meant. And I was able to go, thank you. I just wanted to clarify because there is a perception that what you just said could be read into that. And I wanted to make sure that I wasn't associating or assuming that that's what you meant. But that's not always how this goes. We do think very much like if you're either against me or for me, one way or the other. And part of that is the culture in which we live, where we have to celebrate everything. And if you don't celebrate it, then you must be against it. So one of these things in our political world that we have right now, it's a very easy example for us to give, would be the premise of, and I love this discussion, it's the concept of banning books. So how many of you have seen any of the things about banning books and how that's playing itself out right now? It's typically in the state of Florida, California, and other places, the banning of books. And I love that that's the concept that's thrown forth is these people are banning books, as opposed to what I do know, because I've done the research on it, it's not the banning of the books, it's the banning of pornography under a certain age. So the argument in essence is under the age of 13, there should not be sexually explicit books in children's libraries and so forth. And then the opposite argument is not, though, well, you should have sexually explicit pornography in essence in books in school libraries. It's to say, no, now you're just banning books. And so you deflect, you change the subject, you no longer talk about what's actually happening. So instead of being specific, you be broad-minded. This is the political spectrum on which we live today. And so that's why I'm a big fan of being very particular about what we say and what we believe in. I also believe that we have gotten to a point in life where we love to change terminologies to better fit. There is a war on words that is happening in our current political world, and that's why I think it's important to have very specific understandings of different things. So books shouldn't be banned, but age appropriate is crucial. I would absolutely agree with that. I would take it personally a step farther. I do believe pornography should just be banned outright. I'm not referencing any book that has nudity or the rest in it as pornography. I am referencing actually sexually explicit material should be banned for the good of mankind. That's Brandon's personal thing. I do believe also that there are things that can be educational in nature, and I'm referencing even things like Renaissance art and things like that that have nudity within them. I don't believe that they are pornography in any way, shape, or form. They're not pornographic in their intent. And then you also have the other aspect of, you look at nudity from the standpoint of nursing programs and medicals and so forth. So look, there are qualifications in which these things would be appropriate, in which they would be good. I do not understand the argument for children. In fact, I think that if we were to get to a point and realize how seared some of our consciences have become as it pertains to the things that we place before our children, I think it should make many of us weep. I think it should make many of us cry before God for the loss of innocence and the war that we have currently over gender identity. And if you want to go back and look at where the whole premise of gender identity came from, as we talked about it a few weeks ago, it should make all of us just mourn for the loss of innocence within our children, especially with social media and a lot of the other things that are happening. But alas, this is where we are right now. So I want to do everything I can to protect my own children from this. So from a political perspective and politics, I do believe that churches have a responsibility to care about what's going on in their culture, to care about what's going on around them, and to do their best to give people the best opportunities to make informed decisions along the way. I do believe I do believe it's not, believe it or not, a separation of church and state nearly as much as a separation of state from the church. I believe the state has far too much say in churches as they are right now. You look back on the pandemic, I don't believe any state had the right or especially the United States, had the right or the um, ability to stop people from worshiping God to the best of their abilities, including gathering. Now, that is a personal feeling, okay? I'm not making universal statements. I'm speaking for myself and myself alone. I find it problematic, but I also understand why some churches did. I understand why a lot of churches did go online. You are talking to someone who is speaking online, who teaches online all the time. So I know the value. In fact, during the COVID lockdowns, I specifically taught online Bible classes for 6 months. Every Sunday for churches and people across the United States that did not have Bible classes available to them. All they had was their worship times that were being done online. And so we wanted to offer some Bible classes. We did it also for children. And so there were some children's classes that they could tune into and watch and be part of that. But I personally do not believe the government had the ability to make such a decision. To see some of the things that have happened in Canada and other places from the political perspective, I struggle with that, especially with what I saw as sometimes fear would set in. I understand wisdom. I understand doing your best in the situation, but I met a lot of people who lived in fear. Lived in fear of that, what was going to go wrong, as if God somehow was surprised by the pandemic, as God was somehow surprised by what was going on or what was happening. And I do believe in some ways, and this is where I want to look at what happened across the pandemic politically, and I mourn for our loss of influence in a lot of ways. I also believe that there was what would a good way of putting this, a culling from within churches of people who used to go to church every Sunday, but they never were there. In fact, I used to call it, there's a difference between attendance and presence. And there was a lot of people who attended worship and attended church prior to the pandemic who never returned, but I would easily make the argument they weren't there before. They were simply well-dressed corpses in the pews. And that may seem like a harsh statement, but the reality is that there are many who left the churches, left church and worship altogether. They left God purely because it had become a habit. It was a habit. It wasn't necessarily a walk of faith. Now, that's not everyone. Now, again, I feel like this need to quantify all of this instead of just being able to wish that you would understand what I mean by that, and that I'm not making a blanket statement, but instead I'm saying this is my personal opinion. This is what I saw. This is what I witnessed from many. And I also don't believe it was a negative thing. I think that there's a healthy aspect where God utilizes moments like this to show, and for us to be able to evaluate who we are and what's going on within our own churches. Are we creating attendees, or are we truly people who come to worship to be in the presence of God? And that is something that churches, especially in a very marketed world, in a very material world, in a very church culture world, I think that's a good thing for us to have to go through every once in a while, that we would see some of these things and kind of look at them and understand them. So I mentioned that just in passing. So politically, I have a couple of other things I'd love to share with you, specifically some on from C.S. Lewis, as he notes some of my favorite little quotes from his. So these are from 6 quotes that he wrote on government, on economics, on political freedom, economic freedom, and so forth, that I just kind of want to throw out there. On a democratic government. Now, you have to understand also he is from the UK, so he's not referencing US political structures. He is referencing, however, his own that he had. And he says this, he says, I am a Democrat because I believe in the fall of man. I think most people are Democrats for the opposite reason. A great deal of democratic enthusiasm descends from the ideas of people like Rousseau, who believed in democracy because they thought mankind so wise and good that everyone deserved a share in the government. The danger of defending democracy on those grounds is that that's not true. And so I love this, what he says in this premise. And in essence, what he's saying is, I believe that mankind is fallen and that they're not good people and that we have fallen away from God. And that's why we need to learn how to share. We need to learn how to give. We need to learn how to do all these things because it's not intrinsic to us. But he makes the argument is the problem with so many people out there in the political world is that it sounds good to, social welfare programs and all those different things. But it's because we think they're good people, and that these good people are the ones making these arguments. They're not. This is not because they're good people. They're most of the time, especially these concept of leaders and rulers and our elected officials and senators and congressmen and presidents and so forth, do it because it's what politically expedient or what their base wants, but it's not because it's what's morally right in light of our own sin. So I love that he makes that distinction between the two, that he directly says, I believe these things because I believe that mankind is evil and needs to learn to be good. The problem is everybody else thinks they're good, and that's why they're doing those things. And that's not necessarily what's right. They need Jesus as their salvation, and then they will learn to give, as opposed to, well, if we just take care of their needs, that somehow that will make the world a better place. No, these people will still die in their sins. And so that's part of his argument. So one of the things that he specifically notes is this, that I also thought was fantastic on government and politics, and especially expanding government, larger and larger government. He said, the modern state exists not to protect our rights, but to do us good or make us good. Anyway, to do something to us or to make us something. Hence the new name, leaders, for those who were once rulers. We are less their subjects than their wards, pupils, or domestic animals. There is nothing left or which we can say to them, mind your own business. Our whole lives is their business. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read that, my first thought was, that sounds about right, about how so often the people especially are viewed in the United States in light of government, that they are no longer our rulers, they are our leaders, and but they are wards, pupils, as if we are domesticated animals, of which we can't say, get out of our business, like, just leave us alone. They go, no, my whole entire existence is your business. I'm here to do this. So I thought that was an interesting insight. And what's funny is most of these are from the 1920s and 1930s, and so you look forward now and you're like, wow, that was pretty spot on even for that time. Now, another thing that I think would be interesting to note is on specifically on economics. So, if you're in politics today with the banking issues that we're having, a lot of these other things from political discussion, I thought this was an interesting concept. He says, "I believe a man is happier and happy in a richer way if he has the freeborn mind, but I doubt whether he can have this without economic independence, which the new society is abolishing." For economic independence allows an education not controlled by the government. And in adult life, it is the man who needs and asks nothing of government who can criticize its acts and snap its fingers at its ideology. So the separation of both the fact that a man who has the ability to do something on his own is of no need he has no need of government. And that's the worst thing the government could happen to them, is for a man to not need them, or for a person to not need them. And thus it's to the best of a government for them to provide such where everyone needs them on a consistent basis. So it's an interesting kind of political play there, especially when it comes to the welfare state concept. If you give man all that he needs, then he won't need to go out and do anything for his own, but he will always need that which is provided for him by others. And then another one, especially on the welfare state, and then we'll look at Christian politics. Is there any possibility of getting the super welfare state's honey and avoiding the sting? Let us make no mistake about the sting. The sweetest sadness is only a foretaste. To live his life in his own way, to call his house his castle, to enjoy the fruits of his own labor, to educate his children as his conscience directs, to save for the prosperity after his death, these are wishes deeply ingrained in civilized man. Their realization is almost as necessary to our virtues as to our happiness. From their total frustration, disastrous results, both moral and psychological, might follow. And I do love the premise of getting the super welfare state's honey while avoiding the sting. And the reality is you cannot. He makes the argument that you cannot avoid the sting of the bee when collecting the honey if you're constantly in need of others. So, and then the last one I'll share here says, he who converts his neighbor has performed the most practical Christian political act of all. He who converts his neighbor has performed the most practical Christian political act of all. Now, he's not talking about converting his neighbor to a political party, but converting them to Jesus. In any of that case, he's saying that is a conversion of political that is the most practical, that is the most beautiful of them all. And so I do love his consistency towards the fact that, yes, he has opinions on politics, he loved politics, but he also is very practical on what the most good could be done to humankind had to be with the conversion to Jesus Christ. So I lay out a lot of these things for you, especially on Christians and politics. Gave you a few of the quotes along the way. But one of the things I also want to note on, especially in our politics today, I do believe that Christians have the ability to partake in politics, to be involved in politics, so forth. I do believe that much like anything in life, one has to constantly go into it with a strong sense of conviction and a strong sense of who they are, and with their identity based purely on Jesus Christ. And their identity, if it's found in a political party, if they are a Republican first or a Democrat first or a Libertarian first or whatever it may be, that they're in danger of becoming so myopic in their view of how God works or how things work, that they might not see that God might be using even their political opponents in some ways. They lose an election, that they're suddenly it's the end of the world, or it may be God is working in those ways for a reason, for a time like that, and so forth. That we think that everything revolves around us and the rest, but I don't believe that there's any problem with Christians being involved in politics. In fact, I think we need more Christians involved in politics. But I'm not referencing Christians because I think we need more of an agenda-driven concept in our political world. As I noted kind of just in passing very quickly earlier, I believe the state should spend less time involved in church matters. I don't believe that Christians should be divorced from the cultural movements of what's happening in the world. I mentioned also the war of words that we saw earlier, that we see quite a bit, and I'll mention this just as an example. If I were to tell you, if I were to use the terminology, what's a good way of putting this? If I were to say traditional marriage, if I were to use that terminology, in fact, that's a commonly accepted terminology today. I typically do not use that terminology personally. There's a reason for that. Because if I use the terminology traditional marriage, then it gives the implication that there is such a thing as non-traditional marriage. Instead, I try to be very specific in my language. There is marriage, period. And I believe marriage is not just between a man and a woman, but I believe it is an ordination by God. It is not something that is bound by state sanctions or that the state has candidly much to say about it in any way, shape, or form. However, I also understand that that terminology is one that was lost 30 years ago. When we accepted the idea of traditional marriage versus non-traditional marriage, that's where we found ourselves losing part of the battle. In our modern world, you see it in terminologies, for example, like pro-choice. Pro-choice is a political game that's played specifically when it comes to abortion. And I believe that the other side of the aisle on that right is fairly significant in the concept that pro-life. Pro-choice makes it seem like all that's happening is a choice is happening. That's not true. There is the death of a child in that light. So I use this as an example of terminologies. I believe we have to be very particular in our terminologies. And that's why I think it's important for us to define what we mean when we say what we mean and how we say it and why we say it and so forth. It's important for us to do that, especially if we go into politics. And so as a Christian in politics and involved in political aspects of things, then you can't just go along to get along. You can't just go along if you're in the Democrat Party, Republican Party. You have have to make stands on things that you believe to be true, even if it were to cost you something. One of my dear friends, love him dearly. He's a fantastic man by the name of John DeBerry in the state of Tennessee. He has been a Democratic representative for the city of Memphis for, I think it was like 26 years, long time, but an advocate for the life of the unborns in a major way. So much so that he was literally primaried after 26 years of representing the state of Tennessee, primaried by his own party, the Democratic Party, to a point where he lost out, was taken off the ballot because of the fact of his pro-life stances, and including, if you can go watch on YouTube, some of his speeches on the Tennessee state floor with his good friend Sheila Butt, who is a Republican from the state of Tennessee, both of them members of the Churches of Christ, and having beautiful connections together and working and putting out a lot of bills together where you have, in essence, politically across the aisle, but that they held strong to specific convictions that were of very strong Christian ideals. And he lost his seat. Now, if you know, God often has a sense of humor, and so where the Democrat Party removed him from his seat because of his stance on being pro-life, a pro-life Democrat in the city of Memphis, he was then appointed as a special advisor to the governor, who is a Republican in the state of Tennessee. And so he's now got more power than he ever did before as a special assistant to the governor for the state of Tennessee, even at this point in time. Sheila Butt was in the state house for 8 years and is now the mayor of Columbia, Tennessee, and is doing a fantastic job. And here you have two people on two different political aisles, but who have made very strong political stances in their life that are based around their faith and based around who they are as believers, as Christians. And they were unwavering in those, in the face of adversity, in the face of people disagreeing with them along the way. And I'm so grateful that I have examples that I can give you of specific individuals who are not only in politics, but are doing good things and are making changes. And they even disagree on, they may disagree on some things that are not matters of, I would call, even salvation. I believe murder to be a matter of salvation. Pro-murder, pro-not murder. I believe God from the very beginning says, thou shalt not murder. And I believe that is the case, especially for those who are none of their doing are in a place that should be the safest place in the world to them, which is their mother's womb. There's enough evil in this world for us to not find a common ground on that. Now, I do know that this is my personal opinion, but I do believe not only it's biblical and scriptural, but it's not based on a cultural argument of choice or trying to find out every little minutia of the small things. I think it goes back to our consciences been seared so much by the political arguments that we've missed what's actually happening, which is the loss of a life. So, politics and Christians, I don't think that they are, much like science and the Bible, they're not at odds. They have a game to play. They have a life that coexists in so many ways. We need good people in politics. We need good people involved in local government. We need good people involved on state level, on the national level, and the rest, without a doubt. And I do believe that you can disagree with someone on political things and still be brothers and sisters in Christ. And that's a fantastic and wonderful thing. I do believe there are a few things that are a matter of doctrine, that do play into how I believe a Christian should believe. Now, again, that's not just personal. I do believe I can make a fairly good arguments on what those things are, but that doesn't mean that I have to agree with all social policies or all the other things that go along. In fact, I can disagree with somebody about social policies and they could still be my brother and sister in Christ. And I would hope that they're disagreeing with me, they would also extend the same olive branch. So, that's where we're at. I appreciate so much all of your feedback. There's some great quotes from C.S. Lewis that I'll go and post in there also. And I'll close you out with this last little quote from the Screwtape Letters. In fact, so if you know anything about C.S. Lewis and writing on the Screwtape Letters, this is a demon writing to another demon about how he should keep people involved, he should keep them distracted from Jesus. So he's telling them how he needs to help his patient, and the patient specifically is a human, a being, and the rest. And he's teaching him how to distract him, how to get him to hell, in essence. So this is what Screwtape, this demon, tells to this other demon. He says, and he's referencing politics, said, whichever he adopts, that's whichever side of the aisle he adopts, your main task will be the same. Let him begin by treating the patriotism or the pacifism as a part of his religion. Then let him, under the influence of partisan spirit, come to regard it as the most important thing. Then quietly and gradually nurse him on the stage at which the religion becomes merely a part of the cause, in which Christianity is valued chiefly because of the excellent argument it can produce in favor of the British war effort or of the pacifism. The attitude which you want to guard against is that in which temporal affairs are treated primarily as material for obedience. Once you have made the world an end, and faith a means, you have almost won your man, and it makes very little difference what kind of worldly end he is pursuing. Provided that meetings, pamphlets, policies, movements, causes, and crusades matter more to him than prayers and sacraments and charity, he is ours, and the more religious on these terms, the more secularly ours he really is. I can show you a pretty cageful of people down here already. In essence, he's referencing hell. And so I love, like, when you put all those things first, that's literally the argument from this demon is have him put all those things first and then have him believe that his faith is what will drive those things instead of it being the things about prayers, sacraments, charity, and the rest. So thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. As always, it is a joy to be with you all. For all those of you watching later, thanks so much for tuning in. Let me know, add to your comments along the way. I love going back and watching and reading comments throughout the week. I will post some of these quotes here in a little bit in there so you can see these as per usual. I'm very, very excited. Let me look real quick and to see what we're doing next week. Let me pull that up real quick and see where we're going. So next week, under the rabbit hole, we are going to be on, oh goodness, climate change. We are going to be talking about climate change. So that should be fun. We will be the Christian and climate change next week. Should be a truly fascinating discussion. I look forward to seeing you all then. I hope you all have a wonderful week. If you have any questions, thoughts, please add them into the group, and we'll see you next week.